So, with this new hedge of protection, Ezra was thrilled to be able to go back to Jerusalem with the decree from King Artaxerxes. But Ezra remembered that it was God who had caused the king to make such a generous decree. So the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord as the rivers of water. He turns them however he wills. Ezra thanked God for putting such desires into the heart of the king. He knew it was God's good hand upon him that enabled him to tackle this great undertaking with confidence, and that the mightiest earthly king is still under God's dominion. Ezra thought about asking King Artaxerxes for a band of soldiers to accompany them and protect them from the bandits and other dangers along the journey. But then he decided not to do this because he had told the king that the good hand of his God was upon them and would take care of them. He reasoned that if he asked the king for soldiers to protect them, the king might think that Ezra's God was not strong enough to protect them. And he didn't want to give God a bad name by asking for extra protection. So instead of asking for soldiers to protect him and his band, Ezra decided to have a prayer meeting with his travelers and ask God to protect them, to give them journeying mercies. Ezra wanted everyone to know how great and trustworthy God is. Therefore, by the banks of a small river called Ahava, they held a prayer meeting before they left Babylon. They fasted or they went without food in order to concentrate on seeking God's help and guidance for their families on their dangerous journey. So here they go again with the assurance that God would be with them to protect them and be with them. Ezra the priest and his band of pilgrims started out on their long, dangerous journey, the journey to Jerusalem. So God answered their prayers and guided them safely to the land of Israel. When they finally arrived at Jerusalem, they offered sacrifices and burnt offerings to thank God for protecting them on their hazardous journey. So before Ezra even was settled in the land of Israel, he heard distressing news from the leaders at Jerusalem. They told him that many of the Jewish people in their leaders had drifted far away from God and had become like the heathen around them, and that they had intermarried with the heathen. In the New Testament, God instructs believers not to be unequally yoked with unbelievers. That is, a saved person should not marry an unsaved person. For when a believer marries an unbeliever, the believer usually becomes the unbeliever or like the unbeliever. So when Ezra heard this news about the Jews that had intermarried with the heathen, he felt so sad that he showed his grief and his distress in the customary Jewish way. By tearing his clothes and pulling his hair out of his beard, Ezra then realized how desperately the Jewish people needed to know the Word of God. Of course, God had already known this. That's why he had put it on Ezra's heart and granted him the permission to come to Israel to teach the Jews the word of God. In Ezra's great grief, he fell to his knees, his hands spread out unto the Lord, and began to pray. He told the Lord that he was ashamed to face him when he thought about the sins of the Jewish people. With weeping, Ezra confessed to God the sins of the Jewish people and asked God to forgive them. So, though Ezra had not sinned in this matter, he prayed as though he too were guilty of such sins, knowing that similar sins had caused Israel to be taken captive by Babylon many, many years before. It grieved Ezra to know that here the Jewish people were doing the same thing again by following the ways of the heathen. As Ezra wept over their sins, a great assembly of men, women, and children joined him. Seeing him weep, they too began to sorrowfully weep over their sins. After praying earnestly, Ezra summoned all the people to meet him in Jerusalem to solemnly correct these matters. So they met with him and they confessed that they had disobeyed God, and they told him they were truly sorry for they had married the heathen wives. They followed Ezra's advice by repenting of their sins and returning to God, and they agreed to put away their heathen wives and live in obedience to God. So all of us will become like the people we run with. Therefore, we need to examine the kind of friends we have. Do our friends help us be better Christians, or do they lead us away from God into sinful attitudes and activities?